The sound of tearing silk was louder than the crashing waves of Lake Michigan. It was the sound of 6 months of labor, 3 years of savings, and a lifetime of dignity being ripped away in a single, jagged motion. Bridget Williams didn't scream. She didn't even move. She simply felt the cold, predatory air of the Grand Pierre Hotel lobby hit the bare skin of her back, where the kente silk fusion, her masterpiece, now hung in ruins. To her left, the paparazzi's flashes became a strobe light of humiliation, capturing the exact moment the rising star of Midwest architecture was reduced to a punchline. "I told you," James Vanneau sneered, his breath a foul cocktail of vintage scotch and unearned entitlement. He leaned in, his voice a greasy whisper against her ear. "You don't belong in the gold leaf elevators, darling. Oh, you're just the help in a fancy dress. And now everyone sees you for what you really are." He let the shredded fabric slip through his fingers like trash. Bridget's vision tunneled. She could see the hotel security guards, men she had greeted by name, looking at their polished shoes. They knew the Vanneau name. They knew the Vanneaus owned the precinct, the unions, and the ground the hotel was built on. In this room, James Vanneau was a god, and Bridget was a sacrifice. 10 seconds, she thought, her lungs tightening as if the very oxygen in the lobby was being taxed. "I have 10 seconds before I break." Then the air changed. The heavy, brass-trimmed, revolving doors didn't just spin. They seemed to groan under the weight of an approaching storm. A sudden pressurized draft swept through the lobby, smelling of rain-soaked asphalt, his expensive sandalwood, and something sharper, the metallic tang of ozone before a lightning strike. The chatter of the socialites died. The camera shutters froze. Kwang-sun stepped into the light. He didn't look like a venture capitalist. He looked like a blade carved from midnight. Flanked by 4 men whose charcoal suits moved with the synchronized lethality of a wolf pack, he didn't spare a glance for the Vanneau brothers or the cowering security. His eyes, dark, bottomless, and terrifyingly focused, locked onto the tear in Bridget's dress. The world went silent. It was as if the ghost of Gyeonggi had sucked the sound out of the room. He reached her in 4 long, measured strides. Without a word, he unbuttoned his hand-tailored overcoat. The wool was heavy, warm, and smelled of the wood smoke and rain that followed him everywhere. And he draped it over her shoulders, his fingers grazing the nape of her neck for a fraction of a second, a touch that felt like a silent promise of war. "Who?" Kwang-sun asked. His voice wasn't loud. It was a low, melodic vibration that seemed to rattle the crystal flutes on the nearby bar. It was the sound of a man who didn't need to shout to be obeyed. James Vanneau, fueled by liquid courage, took a step forward, a smirk still twitching on his face. "It's just a dress, man. I'll buy her 10 more. Who the hell are you anyway? You lost?" Kwang-sun didn't turn his head. He didn't even acknowledge James's existence. He kept his gaze on Bridget's eyes, watching the tears she refused to let fall. "Gyeongtae," Kwang-sun said softly. His lead enforcer stepped forward, bowing slightly. "To sir?" "The Vanneau bloodline ends tonight," Kwang-sun commanded, his voice cold enough to frost the marble. "Not just the men, the assets, the name. Erase them from the memory of this city. We are just getting started. Before the ghost unleashes hell, drop your location in the comments. Are you watching from the streets of Chicago or the heart of London? If you aren't subscribed to my Afro-Korean Boss stories, you're missing out on the only channel that gives you the justice you crave. Subscribe now or tell us in the comments exactly why you're choosing to miss out on the takeover." The silence following Kwang-sun's command was heavier than the gold leaf molding on the ceiling. James Vanneau's smirk didn't vanish all at once. It eroded piece by piece, one as the gravity of the ghost's presence began to sink into his alcohol-soaked brain. But James was a creature of the Chicago dynasty, a man born with a silver spoon and a heart of lead, and he didn't know how to bow. "You're crazy," James spat, though his voice cracked like dry parchment. You think you can come into my city in my father's hotel and threaten a Vano? I own the very floor you're standing on." Bridget felt the vibration of Kwang-hyuk's chest against her shoulder. He was a statue of ice, his hand still resting firmly on the lapel of the coat he'd wrapped around her. She looked at James, and for the first time that night, the humiliation was replaced by a cold, architectural clarity. She didn't see a powerful man. She saw a system-protected parasite, a crumbling structure held up by nothing but old money and intimidation. To understand the weight of this moment, one had to understand the armor of Kente that now lay in ruins. 6 months ago, Bridget had sat in her small studio in Bronzeville, sketching a design that would bridge her dual heritage. The silk was hand-woven in Ghana, the pattern a specific Adwinasa weave, signifying royalty and the end of all struggles. She'd spent nights hand-stitching the silk to a structural bodice inspired by the steel girders of the Willis Tower. It wasn't just a dress, it was her manifesto. She was at the Grand Pierre to present her firm's bid for the new Lakeside Pavilion. She had beaten out 40 other firms, most of them headed by men who looked like James Vano. This gala was supposed to be the moment the rising star finally touched the sky. James had been watching her from the bar for an hour before the confrontation. He didn't hate her because she was a stranger. He hated her because she was a competence trap. She was better than him. She was the one the board of directors was whispering about, while he was the son they were trying to hide in the VIP lounge. "I'm talking to you, you freak!" James stepped closer, reaching out to grab the lapel of Kwang-hyuk's coat, the coat that was currently protecting Bridget's modesty. Kwang-hyuk didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at Gyeong-tae. The move was so fast the cameras barely caught it. Gyeong-tae intercepted James's wrist in mid-air. The sound of bone meeting a tactical grip was a dull thud. James let out a wheezing gasp as he was forced to his knees. "You touched the silk," Kwang-hyuk said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a razor against the skin. "That was your first mistake. You thought the fabric was her weakness. You thought her beauty was an invitation to your cruelty." He turned his gaze slightly, looking at the lead security guard who had stood by and watched. "And you? You watched a woman be assaulted in your lobby because you feared a name that is already dead. You are fired. Leave your badge on the marble." Bridget clutched the overcoat tighter. The scent of sandalwood from the fabric was grounding her, pulling her back from the edge of a panic attack. She looked at the torn pieces of her kente silk on the floor. James had tried to strip her of her dignity to make himself feel tall. "Ah, Kwan," Bridget whispered, her voice trembling but certain. "He didn't just tear the dress. He tried to tear the bid. He told the board I wasn't hotel material." Kwang-hyuk's eyes darkened until they were pits of obsidian. He finally looked down at James, who was now trembling on the floor, his expensive Scotch-soaked suit looking like a shroud. "You didn't just insult a woman tonight, James," Kwang-hyuk said, his tone absolute. "You insulted a queen of my house. In my world, we don't just sue for damages. We remove the cancer at the root." He leaned down, his face inches from the terrified Vano brother. "By sunrise, your father will be a beggar. Your brothers will be fugitives. And you will be the man who ended a 100-year dynasty because you couldn't keep your hands to yourself." Kwang-hyuk stood up and looked at his men. "Take them, all of them. Start with the warehouses in Gary. I want the Vano name scrubbed from every ledger in this city." As the enforcers dragged the screaming Vano brothers toward the back exits, the lobby of the Grand Pierre remained frozen. The apex predator had intervened, and the mediocre villain had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes. But as Kwang-hyuk steered Bridget toward the revolving doors, he wasn't looking at the victory. He was looking at the way she held her head high, even in the ruins of her masterpiece. "The dress is gone," he murmured as they stepped into the cold Chicago night, where a fleet of black sedans waited like silent panthers. "But the woman who built it, she is just beginning." The black sedans didn't just drive. They glided through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago like shadows cutting through silk. Inside the lead vehicle, the air was pressurized, silent, and thick with the scent of leather and Kwang-sun's cologne, a cold metallic sandalwood that seemed to ground Brigette's fraying nerves. She sat huddled in the back seat, still wrapped in the heavy overcoat that cost more than her first car. Outside the tinted windows, the city she had spent years trying to reshape through her blueprints felt alien, dangerous, and suddenly very small. "You're shaking," Kwang-sun said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of a structural flaw. He didn't reach for her hand. He knew she wasn't ready for a touch, but he shifted his weight, his presence an impenetrable wall between her and the window. "I'm angry," Bridget corrected, her voice brittle. "That dress was 6 months of my life. That gala was 10 years of my career, and James Vanneau destroyed it in 10 seconds because he felt bored." Kwang-sun looked out at the passing lights of the magnificent mile. "He didn't do it because he was bored, Bridget. He did it because he recognized your light and realized he had none of his own. Mediocre men always try to break things they cannot build." He tapped a sequence into a sleek tablet built into the armrest. A live feed flickered to life, showing a grainy thermal view of a warehouse district in Gary, Indiana. "The Vanneaus think their power lies in their name. They are wrong. Their power lies in their logistics, the way they move illegal spirits and union tax steel through the ports. Tonight, we remove the foundation. The rest of the house will collapse on its own." Bridget watched the screen. She saw silent figures in charcoal suits, Kwang-sun's ghost units, moving with surgical precision around the perimeter of a massive Vanneau-owned terminal. There was no shouting, no cinematic explosions, just a quiet, systematic takeover. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, turning to look at him. "We haven't seen each other in 3 years, not since that rainstorm in Seattle." Kwang-sun's gaze finally met hers. In the dim light of the cabin, his eyes looked like dark glass. "I told you in Seattle, Bridget, you are an architect of spaces. I am an architect of consequences. You build the world people live in. I manage the monsters who try to burn it down. When you called me last week to tell me about your debut, did you think I wouldn't be watching?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. 3 years ago, she had been a struggling grad student, huddled under a bus stop in a Seattle downpour. He had pulled up in a car just like this one, offering her an umbrella and a conversation that had lasted until sunrise. She had thought him a wealthy traveler. She hadn't known then that he was the ghost of Gyeonggi, the man who held the leash of the Korean underworld. "I didn't think you'd start a war for me," she said. "This isn't a war," Kwang-sun replied, his tone chillingly calm. "A war is a conflict between equals. This is an extermination." The car slowed as it approached the lower Wacker Drive entrance, but instead of heading toward her apartment, they descended deeper into the subterranean levels of the city. Brigette's architectural mind mapped their location. They were heading toward a private sector not found on public city plans. "Gyeongtae," Kwang-sun spoke into the comms. "Status on the Vanneau patriarch?" "He's at the club on 5th, sir," the enforcer's voice crackled. "He believes James is still at the hotel. He's currently celebrating a new union contract." "Break it," Kwang-sun commanded. "I want the Vanneaus to feel the ground vanish before they even realize they're falling." Kwang-sun turned back to Bridget. He reached out then, his thumb grazing the edge of the overcoat's collar near her jaw. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to his cold demeanor. "In your blueprints, if the load-bearing pillar is compromised, how long does the roof hold?" Bridget blinked, on her professional brain kicking in despite the trauma. "Depends on the material. If it's reinforced steel, maybe minutes. If it's just stone, seconds." "The Vanneaus are stone," Kwang-sun said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "And I am the gravity they forgot to calculate." As the car pulled into a hidden underground garage beneath a nondescript skyscraper in Oak Park, Bridget realized the world she knew was gone. The woman who had walked into the Grand Pierre in silk was dead. The woman stepping out of this car, wrapped in the coat of a Mafia boss, was someone else entirely. The doors opened, revealing a private elevator bank. Kwang-sun stepped out first, offering his hand. It wasn't an invitation, it was a demand for her trust. "Tonight you stay in the sanctuary," he said. "Tomorrow, you decide if you want to rebuild your firm on the ruins of their empire. But for now, let me show you what happens to people who touch what belongs to me. The Vano Empire is crumbling in real time. Are you really going to stay a spectator? Subscribe to my Afro-Korean Boss stories right now to gain VIP access to the Ghost's inner circle. If you choose to stay unsubscribed, drop a comment and tell us, are you more afraid of the Vanos or the Ghost? The penthouse in Oak Park wasn't just a residence. It was a command center disguised as a palace of glass and obsidian. While the world outside believed the ghost of Gyeonggi was merely a reclusive venture capitalist, the rows of monitors humming in the sub-level office told a different story. Kwang-sun stood before a wall of glass overlooking the Chicago skyline, his silhouette sharp and predatory. Behind him, Bridget sat on a leather sofa, the weight of the night finally settling into her bones. She watched him. His stillness was more terrifying than the violence he commanded. "Gyeongtae," Kwang-sun said, not turning around. "Report." The enforcer's voice came through the high-fidelity speakers, cool and detached. "The Vano warehouses in Gary are secured. We found more than just illegal spirits, sir. We found the ledger linking the Vanos to the union kickbacks. We've already leaked the encrypted files to the federal task force. By 3 a.m., the IRS will have frozen every personal and corporate account associated with the name." Bridget gasped. "Every account? That's thousands of employees, families?" Kwang-sun turned, his expression unreadable. "Now, the Vanos used those employees as shields for 3 generations. I am simply removing the shield. The innocent will be rehired under a new subsidiary by morning. The guilty, however, will have nowhere to hide." He walked toward a secondary screen and swiped his hand across the air. A live feed from a high-end private club in the city appeared. There, James's father, Arthur Vano, sat with a cigar in his mouth, laughing with a city councilman. He had no idea that his entire net worth was evaporating into the digital ether. "James thought a dress was just fabric," Kwang-sun said, his voice dropping an octave. "He thought you were a marginalized target he could crush to feel powerful. He didn't realize that in my world, you are the foundation, and when the foundation is disrespected, or the structure must be razed." The scene on the monitor shifted. Suddenly, Arthur Vano's phone rang. Then the councilman's phone. Then the club's security approached the table. The confusion on Arthur's face was palpable. Within seconds, the man who had walked into the club as a king was being escorted out like a common trespasser. His credit cards had been declined. His car service had been canceled. His name no longer carried weight. "It's not enough to kill a man like that," Kwang-sun murmured, walking back toward Bridget. "Death is a mercy. I want them to live through the erasure. I want them to walk the streets of Chicago as ghosts, ignored by the very people they once stepped on." He sat in the chair opposite her, his long legs crossed. For a moment, the apex predator vanished, replaced by the man she had met in Seattle. "You think I am a monster, Bridget?" She looked at the ruin of her dress on the side table, then back at him. "I think the world is full of monsters, Kwang. Most of them wear suits and tear people apart for sport. At least you do it with a purpose." Kwang-sun's eyes narrowed. "My purpose tonight was to ensure that no one ever feels comfortable enough to touch you again. If I have to burn this city's social hierarchy to the ground to send that message, I will." The chapter ends as a new notification pings on Kwang-sun's screen, an alert from Seoul. The systematic dismantling of the Vanyos had triggered a response 7,000 miles away. The erasure wasn't just a local cleanup, it was the first shot in a global war. The air in the Oak Park penthouse felt different. Thicker, heavier, and saturated with the scent of rain and expensive cedar. It was a lair, in every sense of the word, a fortress of glass that overlooked the flickering lights of Chicago, yet felt completely detached from the world below. Kwang-sun had left Bridget in the master suite to clean the literal and metaphorical dirt off herself. As she stood under the rainfall shower, the water steaming against the marble tiles, she watched the remnants of the night wash away. But the humiliation wasn't a physical stain. It was a memory of hands on her skin and the sound of tearing fabric. When she emerged, she found a silk robe, black, heavy, and undeniably Korean in its minimalist cut, waiting for her. She stepped into the main living area, where the lights were dimmed to a low amber glow. Kwang-sun was not in a suit anymore. He wore a simple black cashmere sweater, and his sleeves pushed back to reveal the edge of a tattoo, a dragon's tail coiling around his forearm, as he poured 2 glasses of dark amber liquid. "Drink," he commanded. It was an absolute imperative, yet his voice held a softness she hadn't heard in the lobby. "It's a vintage from the year you were born. It's meant to settle the nerves." Bridget took the glass, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a jolt through her that was more intoxicating than the spirits. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city she had tried to build her life in. "You don't have to do this for a dress, Kwang," she whispered, her reflection in the glass, looking ghostly and fragile. "The Vanos are already ruined. You've taken their money, their name. Isn't that enough?" Kwang-sun walked up behind her. He didn't touch her, but his heat radiated against her back, a physical barrier against the cold world outside. "It was never about the dress, Bridget," he replied, his voice a low vibration in the small space between them. "It was about the fact that they felt comfortable enough to lay a hand on you. In my world, that means I haven't been feared enough in this city. That means the shadow I cast wasn't long enough to protect what is mine." Bridget turned to face him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm not a piece of property, Kwang. I'm an architect. I build things." "I know exactly what you are," he said, stepping closer until she could see the golden flecks in his dark irises. "I've watched you for 3 years. I watched you win the bid for the Southside Library. I watched you lose your first firm to a corrupt partner and build a second one out of the ashes. You are a creator of worlds. That is why they tried to break you. They are destroyers. They cannot stand the sight of someone who can make something from nothing." The tension in the room shifted from the violence of the streets to a seductive danger. The way he looked at her wasn't with pity. It was with a terrifying level of respect. He saw her competence trap and valued it more than her beauty. "You've been watching me?" she asked, her breath hitching. "I never truly left Seattle," he admitted. "I just moved the pieces so the board would be ready for tonight." He reached out then, his hand, calloused and steady, cupping her jaw. His thumb traced the line of her lower lip. "The Vanos are a symptom of a larger disease. They thought you were a weakness I was hiding. They thought, by hurting you, they could make me move my hand from the throat of this city." Bridget leaned into his touch, the phoenix structure of her own resolve beginning to rise. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the focal point of a global storm. "And did they?" she asked. "Did they make you move your hand?" Kwang-sun's expression darkened into something lethal. "I moved my hand so I could pick up a blade. Tonight, Bridget, you aren't just a guest in my house. You are the reason the ghost of Gyeonggi returns to his throne." The moment of intimacy was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic pulsing from the workstation in the corner. An encrypted notification was flashing red across all 3 monitors. Kwang-sun's demeanor snapped back to the cold Mafia boss in a heartbeat. and he stepped toward the screens, his fingers flying across the keys, with a speed that spoke of a different kind of mastery. "What is it?" Bridget asked, moving to stand beside him. "A breach," he muttered, "but not in Chicago." He pulled up a file that had been intercepted from a Vano server. It was a digital paper trail that shouldn't have existed. As the data decoded, Bridget's eyes widened. She saw names she recognized: local city officials, Chicago PD brass, linked to a series of accounts in Seoul. But it was the last file that stopped her heart. It was a photo taken 48 hours ago. It showed James Vanyo meeting with a man in a high-rise office in South Korea. The man was Kwon-hyuk's uncle, the current acting head of the Seoul Council. "They set you up," Bridget whispered. "No," Kwon-hyuk corrected, and his eyes fixed on the screen. "They set us up. The dress wasn't a random act of a drunk heir. It was a timed provocation. They wanted to see if I would overextend my resources in Chicago to protect a foreign interest." He looked at Bridget, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine concern in his eyes. The sanctuary was no longer safe. The Vanos were just the bait. The real predator was 7,000 miles away, and he had just seen Kwon-hyuk's hand. "They think you are my weakness," Kwon-hyuk said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "They think they can use your life to bargain for my crown." Bridget looked at the screens, then at the man beside her. She didn't feel like a weakness. She felt like the architect who finally saw the flaw in the enemy's design. The sanctuary just became a war room. How are you going to leave Bridget and Kwon-hyuk to face the Seoul Council alone? Subscribe to my Afro-Korean Boss stories right now, or explain your betrayal in the comments. The ghost doesn't forget a face or a missed subscription. The blue light of the monitors washed over Bridget's face, turning her skin into a landscape of flickering data and shadows. She stood in the lair, her architectural mind doing what it did best, identifying patterns in the chaos. While Kwon-hyuk was focused on the movement of his uncle's fleets in the East Sea, Bridget was looking at the metadata of the encrypted file that had triggered the alarm. "Kwon," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans, "look at the routing numbers on the Vano deposits. They aren't just coming from Seoul." Kwon-hyuk leaned over her shoulder, yet his proximity a constant electric presence. "They're routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Standard procedure for the Vanos." "No," Bridget countered, her finger tracing a string of alphanumeric code on the glass. "Look at the origin tag before the bounce, a TL-LS-99. That's not a Cayman tag. That's a legacy routing code from the old Atlanta Federal Reserve System. It hasn't been used in 20 years. Kwon-hyuk froze. He pulled the code into a secondary processor, his jaw tightening as the decryption bars climbed toward 100%. "Atlanta? Your mother was a textile designer in Georgia before she moved to Chicago, wasn't she?" "She was an importer," Bridget corrected, a cold chill settling in her stomach. "But she didn't just deal in silk. She worked with a partner, a woman named Elena. And my mother disappeared when I was 10. She told me she had to go away to secure the foundation. I thought she meant a business deal. I haven't seen her since." The screen flashed green. The file opened, revealing a series of scanned ledger pages from 2 decades ago. They weren't just business contracts, they were treaties. The Vanyos hadn't just accidentally run into Bridget at the hotel. They had been tracking her for years, waiting for the moment the ghost of Gyeonggi became interested in her. The dress incident wasn't a test of Kwon-hyuk's temper. It was a verification of her identity. "My uncle didn't hire the Vanyos to distract me," Kwon-hyuk murmured, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "He hired them to find the key." "Bridget, your mother didn't just disappear. Oh, she was the architect of the African interests for the global syndicate. She was the one who brokered the original alliance between the Seoul Council and the Lagos trade unions." Bridget stepped back, her legs feeling like they were made of water. "You're saying my mother was part of this? That my entire life, My career, my firm, was just a cover. Not a cover, Kwang-sun said, turning her to face him. He gripped her shoulders, his gaze intense. A legacy. The Vanos didn't tear your dress to humiliate you. They tore it to see if you were wearing the mark, the ancestral tattoo your mother's lineage carries. When James saw it on your back, he sent the confirmation to Seoul. Bridget thought back to the jagged tear in her silk gown. The skin James had exposed wasn't just bare. It bore a small, intricate geometric brand near her shoulder blade, a birthmark she had always been told was a family tradition. They have what they want, Kwang-sun said, his voice hardening. They know who you are. Now they're going to try to take you to force the Lagos accounts to open. My uncle isn't just trying to seize my throne, he's trying to consolidate the entire Afro-Korean trade route. The encrypted betrayal was complete. Bridget wasn't just a woman in need of protection. She was the missing piece of a multi-billion-dollar chess game. The Vanos weren't just bullies. They were scouts for a predator much larger than James Vano could ever imagine. "What do we do?" Bridget asked, her eyes moving from the screen to the man she had once thought was just a venture capitalist. Kwang-sun reached for a heavy, matte black briefcase under the desk. "We stop playing defense. If they want the key, we'll give them a front row seat to the lockbreaking. We're going to hit the Vanos where they breathe, and then we're going to send a message to Seoul that can be heard from the bottom of the Pacific." He opened the case, revealing a series of encrypted comms units and a tactical map of Lower Wacker Drive. "They think you're the prey, Bridget. Let's show them what happens when the architect decides to redesign the battlefield." The transition from sanctuary to war room happened in the span of a single heartbeat. The luxury of the Oak Park penthouse, the soft amber lighting and the vintage spirits felt like a dream that had been violently interrupted by the cold, digital reality on the monitors. Kwang-sun stood at the center of the room, his charcoal sweater replaced by a tactical vest that managed to look as expensive as his suits. His men, the ghost units, moved through the living space with a terrifying lack of noise, checking weapons and encrypted comms. They didn't look like guards. They looked like shadows given physical form. "Yong-tae," Kwang-sun barked, his voice no longer melodic but sharp as a scalpel. "The Vanos are moving. They know the erasure has started, and they're panicking. Arthur Vano is trying to flee to his private airstrip in Gary. James and his brothers are currently in a fortified SUV heading toward the Lower Wacker service tunnels." Bridget watched them. Her world had shifted from blueprints of buildings to blueprints of a betrayal. She felt the weight of her mother's legacy, the ATL-LS-99 code, pulsing in her mind like a heartbeat. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was the prize in a war she hadn't known she was fighting. "You're leaving me here," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Kwang-sun stopped. He walked over to her, his gaze scanning her face as if looking for structural cracks. "It's the safest place in Chicago, Bridget. My men will hold the perimeter. By dawn, the Vanos will be a memory, and I will have dealt with my uncle's interference." "You're going to lose them," she said flatly. Kwang-sun paused, his eyes narrowing. "Explain." Bridget walked to the large digital table in the center of the room. She swiped her hand, clearing his tactical map and replacing it with a complex 3D architectural rendering of the Chicago underground. "You're tracking them via GPS and traffic cams," she said, her finger tracing the service tunnels of Lower Wacker Drive. "But you're looking at it as a roadmap. I look at it as a structure. These tunnels were built in stages between 1926 and 1950. There are blind spots where the old lead-lined support pillars interfere with cellular and GPS signals. If the Vanos have a driver who knows the city, they'll dip into the lower service level at the post office interchange." She tapped a specific pillar on the map. "There. If they hit that gap, they disappear from your monitors. Your men will be chasing ghosts while the Vanos slip out through the old freight tunnels that lead directly to the river." The room went silent. Kwang-sun looked at the map, then at Bridget. For the first time, he didn't see a woman to be protected. He saw a strategist who had just identified a fatal flaw in his design. "Gyung-tae," Kwon-hyuk said, his eyes never leaving Brigette's. "Is she right?" The enforcer checked his tablet, his brow furrowing. "The signal interference zones match her coordinates exactly, sir. We would lose them for 6 minutes, enough time for a switch." Kwon-hyuk stepped closer to Brigitte. The air between them hummed with a new kind of energy, a mutual recognition of power. "You know these tunnels?" "I did my thesis on the subterranean infrastructure of the loop," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I know every load-bearing wall, every forgotten service shaft, and every structural weakness in this city. You want to catch them? You need me in the lead car." Kwon-hyuk didn't argue. He didn't tell her it was too dangerous. He recognized the competence trap had snapped shut, and he was more than willing to walk into it. "Get her a vest," Kwon-hyuk commanded, "and a headset." As they moved toward the elevator, Kwon-hyuk handed her a small, sleek device. "This is a localized jammer. If we get close enough, you tell me where the structural gaps are. I'll drive. You be the eyes." "And the Vanyos?" she asked as the elevator doors closed. "By the time we're done," Kwon-hyuk promised, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "they'll wish they had stayed in the lobby and apologized for the dress." The descent into Lower Wacker Drive felt like entering the intestines of a concrete giant. The air turned damp, thick with the smell of exhaust and old limestone. Kwon-hyuk sat behind the wheel of a matte black armored sedan, his hands relaxed but firm on the leather-wrapped wheel. In the passenger seat, when Brigitte was no longer the woman in the torn silk gown, she was a navigator of shadows, her eyes fixed on a holographic projection of the city's subterranean schematics. "They just crossed the post office interchange," Brigitte said, her voice steady over the roar of the engine. "They're picking up speed. James is panicked. He's going to try for the service ramp at Columbus Drive." "He won't make it," Kwon-hyuk replied, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He shifted gears, the car surging forward with a sound that was less like a motor and more like a predator's growl. Behind them, 3 more black sedans followed in a tight diamond formation, their headlights cutting through the gloom of the tunnels. Up ahead, the taillights of the Vano SUV flickered, a bright, desperate red against the gray concrete. "Kwon." "Look out!" Brigitte shouted as the Vano SUV suddenly swerved, slamming into a row of construction barrels. The impact sent orange plastic flying like shrapnel, but the heavy vehicle didn't slow down. Instead, it veered into a restricted maintenance lane. "They're taking the freight bypass," Brigitte realized, her fingers flying across her tablet. "It's a blind turn. If they make it past the next 3 pillars, they'll hit a reinforced gate that leads to the river docks. Your GPS won't track them through that much lead." "Then we don't let them reach the 3rd pillar," Kwon-hyuk said. He pushed the sedan to its limit. The world outside the windows became a blur of gray pillars and yellow hazard lights. The Vano SUV was weaving, trying to ram Kwon-hyuk's car into the support structures. Only the sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the tunnel like a scream. "At the next pillar, there's a structural gap," Brigitte shouted, her eyes wide as she calculated the physics of the tunnel. "The foundation there was repaired in '92. The concrete is softer, and the flanking space is narrow. If you pin them there, their security detail can't flank us. It's a bottleneck." Kwon-hyuk didn't hesitate. He leaned into the drift, the tires screaming as the car slid sideways with surgical precision. He slammed the reinforced nose of his sedan into the rear quarter panel of the Vano SUV. The impact was violent. The SUV spun, its tires losing traction on the oil-slicked floor. It slammed into the soft pillar Brigitte had identified, the concrete crumbling under the force. The Vano vehicle was wedged, immobile, the smoke pouring from its shattered radiator. Kwon-hyuk brought his car to a dead stop inches from the wreckage. He didn't wait for his enforcers. He stepped out of the car, the cold tunnel air ruffling his hair. Brigitte followed, the heavy overcoat still draped over her tactical vest, her heart drumming a rhythm of pure adrenaline. James Vanneau crawled from the wreckage, his face bloody, his expensive suit now a rag. He looked up at Kwang-sun and then at Brigitte, his eyes filling with a terror that no amount of family money could cure. "Please," James wheezed. "My father. He'll pay anything. The Koreans. They promised us protection." Kwang-sun stood over him, the Chicago skyline towering somewhere far above them, invisible but present. He didn't pull a trigger. He pulled out a phone and started a video call. On the screen, a boardroom in Seoul flickered into view. "Watch," Kwang-sun said to the man on the screen, his uncle. "You're making a mistake, nephew." The older man's voice crackled through the speakers. "The girl is the key to the Lagos trade. If you kill the Vanneaus, you kill the bridge." "I don't need a bridge built by parasites," Kwang-sun said, his gaze shifting to Brigitte. He looked at James one last time. "I'm not going to kill you, James. I've already bought your father's debt. I've seized your homes. Your name is gone. You are now a ghost in a city that forgets quickly." Kwang-sun turned to Brigitte. "The structure is clear. The debris is removed." But as the Vanneau guards were disarmed, a new sound echoed through the tunnel, the slow, rhythmic clap of someone approaching from the shadows of the river gate. A black sedan, unmarked and silent, pulled up. Out stepped a woman Brigitte recognized instantly, a woman with the same sharp jawline and the same calculating eyes. It was Elena, her mother's former partner from Atlanta. The Vanneaus are down, but a ghost from the past just walked into the light. Subscribe to my Afro-Korean Boss stories right now to see the moment Brigitte confronts the woman who helped her mother disappear. If you're not subscribing, tell us in the comments. Do you trust the woman from Atlanta, or is she another predator in the shadows? The air in the tunnel felt thin, pressurized by the settling dust of the crash and the sudden heavy silence of the woman who had emerged from the shadows. Elena stood with a posture that mirrored Kwang-sun's, immovable, regal, and dangerous. Kwang-sun didn't lower his phone. And the video link to Seoul remained active, the face of his uncle, Park Sun-woo, frozen in a mask of calculated indifference. "The Vanneau assets have been liquidated," Kwang-sun said into the phone, his voice echoing off the damp concrete walls. "Their logistics, their ports, their names. By the time the sun rises, the word Vanneau will be nothing more than a footnote in a bankruptcy filing." James Vanneau, still clutching his shattered arm on the ground, let out a pathetic sob. "You can't... The contracts... My father signed..." "Your father signed his life away the moment he shook hands with a man who views his allies as disposable," Kwang-sun countered. He looked back at the screen. "Uncle, did you really think I wouldn't notice the ATL-LS-99 routing codes? Did you think I had forgotten who truly holds the keys to the Lagos-Seoul corridor?" On the screen, his uncle's eyes shifted, a flicker of genuine apprehension finally breaking through. "The alliance was meant to protect the family, Kwang-sun. The girl was always meant to be the bridge. Her mother knew the price of the crown." "The price was a lie." Elena's voice cut through the air. She walked forward, the clicking of her heels sounding like the cocking of a hammer. She didn't look at Kwang-sun. She looked directly at Brigitte. "Your mother didn't hide you to protect the syndicate, Brigitte. She hid you so you wouldn't become a tool for men who don't know how to build anything but cages." Brigitte stepped forward, the heavy overcoat sliding slightly off her shoulder. "If you were protecting me, why did you let the Vanneaus find me? Why did you let them tear my life apart tonight?" "Because a foundation that hasn't been tested is a foundation that will fail," Elena said, her voice devoid of apology. "You needed to see the world as it is, not through blueprints and glass, but through blood and silk. You needed to see that Kwang-sun would burn his own kingdom to keep you standing." Kwang-sun finally lowered the phone, ending the call with a sharp tap of his finger. The silence that followed was absolute. He turned to James Vanneau, who was now barely conscious. "Gyeong-tae," Kwang-sun murmured. "Take them to the processing center. I want the public records of their debt published on every financial wire by dawn. Let the world see how a dynasty dies when it mistakes a queen for a target." The enforcers moved in dragging the broken remains of the Vanneau family into the waiting vans. In minutes, the only people left in the tunnel were Kwang-sun, Brigitte, and Elena. "The Vanneaus are finished," Kwang-sun said, turning to Brigitte. The coldness in his eyes had softened, replaced by a gaze that was disturbingly intimate. "But the war for your mother's legacy is just beginning. My uncle won't stop at a lobby scuffle. He will come for the Lagos accounts next." Brigitte looked at the shattered pillar, the ruined SUV, and the woman from her past. The architecture of her life had been demolished in a single night, leaving her standing in the raw, exposed center of a global conflict. "I'm not a bridge," Brigitte said, her voice gaining a new iron-like quality. "And I'm not a tool." "No," Kwang-sun agreed, a small dark smile playing on his lips. "Oi, you're the architect, and it's time we started rebuilding this world in your image." The subterranean dampness of the Wacker Drive tunnels felt a world away from the gleaming Lagos skyline that now flickered on a tablet held by Elena. The city above them was beginning to stir, the first gray light of a Chicago dawn filtering through the ventilation grates. "The African continent's interests are secured, sir," Elena said, her voice echoing with a military precision that made Brigitte's skin crawl. "The uncle's funds have been diverted to the Lagos accounts as requested. The Seoul Council is in a state of paralysis. They don't know who to fear more, the ghost they lost or the architect they just found." Brigitte gasped, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The Afro-Korean alliance wasn't just a romance, and it certainly wasn't an accident. "My mother, she didn't just work with you. She was the anchor." "Your mother was the silence that kept the world running, Brigitte," Elena said, stepping closer. "Kwang-sun didn't find you in a rainstorm in Seattle by chance. He was sent to find the only person who could bridge the gap between the silk and the blade. Your father didn't just leave you an architecture firm, he left you a map to a kingdom." Brigitte looked at Kwang-sun. The man she had spent the last 3 years thinking of as a reclusive, mysterious savior was part of a design so complex it made her blueprints look like child's play. "You knew," she whispered. "Every time we met, every conversation, it was all part of the merger." Kwang-sun stepped into her space, his presence overwhelming. He didn't deny it. "The meeting was planned. The feelings, those were the variable I couldn't calculate. I came to secure an asset, Brigitte. I stayed because I found a partner who could see the world's flaws as clearly as I do." He reached into the pocket of his tactical vest and pulled out 2 items. In his left hand, he held his heavy, hand-tailored overcoat, a symbol of the protection, the luxury, and the safety of being a ghost's shadow. In his right hand, he held a sleek, matte black semi-automatic, its grip textured for a steady hand. "The Vanneaus are finished, but your family's war is just beginning," Kwang-sun said, his voice dropping to that low, melodic vibration that always made her blood hum. "The Seoul Council will send more than just mediocre heirs next time. They will come for the Lagos accounts, and they will come for you." He held both hands out. A final lethal ultimatum. "You can take the coat, Brigitte. You can go back to your firm, and my men will ensure you are never touched, never insulted, and never seen again. You will be safe, but you will be a secret." He leaned in, his eyes burning with a dark, respectful fire. "Or you can take the gun. You can claim the legacy your mother built and your father protected. You can stop building buildings and start building an empire. You can be the architect of the new world." The silence in the tunnel was deafening. Brigitte looked at the coat, the soft, expensive wool that smelled of him, Then she looked at the weapon, the cold steel that represented the power to never be humiliated again. She thought of the tearing silk in the lobby, the laughter of James Vanneau, and the 20 years of silence from her mother. Bridget didn't hesitate. Her hand moved with the same precision she used to draw a load-bearing wall. She didn't reach for the comfort of the coat. Her fingers closed around the cold, textured grip of the weapon. Kwon-hyuk's smile wasn't kind, it was triumphant. It was the look of a man who had finally found his equal. "The ghost and the architect," he murmured, his hand covering hers on the weapon. "Let's go show them what happens when the Foundation fights back." The screen fades to black as the roar of the black sedan's engine echoes through the tunnel, heading not toward a safe house, but toward the airport, and the throne waiting for them in Seoul. The Vanneaus were just the beginning. The real war starts in the high-rises of Seoul and the ports of Lagos. If you're not subscribed to my Afro-Korean Boss stories, you've just missed the prologue to the most dangerous alliance in history. Next time, we'll go deeper into the Red Diamond files. We'll reveal what happened the moment Bridget touched down in Korea and the shocking truth about her mother's disappearance. You won't believe who is actually running the Lagos trade. Subscribe now and hit the bell, or stay in the dark and wonder what you missed. The ghost is waiting for your loyalty.